We got a noon start. I've got all our materials. Yeah, I think we do. All right. Hope everybody's doing well, staying safe.
Staying healthy.
All right. I think we're ready to get started. So welcome. This is the next in our series of webinars regarding kind of all things estate planning. We're doing these in lieu of the classes that we normally teach around northeastern Wisconsin on estate planning matters. Everybody who registered is going to receive a couple of things. Number one, an article I wrote on this veteran pension benefit, which is our today's topic, and then a printout of basically what are the different benefit levels when it comes to this improved pension program, and some of the qualification, which is going to be part of our topic today is, well, who actually qualifies for any assistance in paying for care. Any other housekeeping things we want to cover before I jump into this?
I don't believe so. I mean, we've got a whole series of them scheduled. They're basically Wednesdays at noon over the next couple of months. We'll remind you about those. You can check our website. You can also check the registration information if you want to see what the topics are that are coming up.
Okay, well, so we're going to jump into it. Again, today's topic is the improved pension program through the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, this one incorrectly gets called aid and attendance all the time. So if somebody says anything about aid and attendance, that's the program we're talking about right here. The reason it gets called that a lot of times is that's the highest pension benefit level and the thing that people are most commonly being awarded when they apply for it. But again, this is actually the improved pension program through the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the aid and attendance is just part of the payments in that program. Okay, so teach class on this stuff all the time, and anytime we're teaching a class on it, we really break it down into sort of 4 categories as to whether or not you're actually going to get any money from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And so the 4 things, and we're going to go through each of them individually, are does the service qualify? So there has to be a veteran. This isn't, you know, I can't apply for it having not served in the military. So service has to qualify, and the service dates and discharge have to qualify. Number 2, there generally is going to need to be, in most instances, some kind of healthcare issue for either the veteran or the spouse of the veteran that is creating unreimbursed medical expenses. And so most of the time, unless you're applying for base pension because you just have very modest income in retirement, or not even retired, even really modest work income, you're going to need to have some kind of health issue going on. Third thing is going to be, in most instances, the income should be no greater than the cost of care. So you have to have unreimbursed medical expenses that are more or less eating up at least a good chunk of somebody's income in order to want to qualify. And then the 4th thing is, what can you have in terms of assets? So that's going to be the start of our program here. I guess one housekeeping matter that we neglected is we're going to address questions if any come in. You have to have registered for the program in order to be able to post questions that we're going to be able to see. So if you're registered and you have questions as we're going, we will either try to address them in the middle of the webinar, or we might, depending on the type of question, hold off until the end. But we'll try and address anything that comes in from anybody. All right, so service qualifications. Who qualifies in terms of their service?
Well, it has to, like Peter said, it has to be a veteran. You have to have 90 days of service in order to qualify for this particular benefit. 1 day of that service, all of the 90 days have to be active duty. 1 day of that active duty service has to have fallen within a wartime period. And the definitions for wartime periods are not necessarily the same ones you would see in like history books. They tend to be a little bit longer on either side of what people historically would think of as a period of war. So you want to make sure that you verify the actual service dates that you have and verify the date range that you think may be applicable to you. So
yeah, in addition, one clarification is the 90 days of active duty service has to be for something other than training purposes. So going to basic training cannot qualify as part of that active duty service.
This does not mean that it requires combat service. It does not mean that it requires service in any particular area. You don't have to be on foreign soil or anything like that. It's whether or not the service is active duty for purposes other than training and whether or not it falls within this period of time.
Yeah. And one last clarification, we're generally focusing right now on older individuals, older veterans who probably served in Vietnam era, Korean War, maybe there's a World War II veteran who's watching as well. If the service was after 1980, or 1980, about September or after, it actually has to be 2 years of active duty service for other than training purposes in order to qualify. But anybody who served prior to 1980, that's where we're talking about this 90 days of active duty service. And in my experience, most people who are putting in an application for this program, it's older individuals who are facing long-term care expenses. And so generally the service is going to be before 1980. But if you're a veteran who served 1980 or later, it would need to be a 2-year active duty service in order to qualify for what we're talking about here today. So that's the basic service qualifications. Also, this is the group that gets missed the most. Surviving spouses of a wartime veteran. As long as they didn't remarry or divorce the veteran before the veteran's death, they can also qualify for this program. And so I can't even tell you how many times we've come across an older man or woman whose spouse served, and they don't even think that there might be any kind of benefit available because their spouse served 50 years ago in the Korean War or whatever it might be. But there is a reduced benefit, but a pension that is available for these surviving spouses. So don't think that just because you didn't serve, there's nothing available to you.
And like Peter said, it's going to be based on whoever your current spouse is at this time. So if you were married to a veteran and then they passed away and you remarried, whether or not you qualify will be based on what your new spouse, whether or not they served and what their service dates were.
Okay, so that's service qualifications. Second thing is, like I said before, generally, does the person have some kind of medical need? There's 3 different levels to this pension program. The base level is essentially just you're assumed to be disabled if you're 65 or older. If you're not 65 or older, you have to be permanently, totally disabled in order to qualify for the program. But if you're over 65, you can just potentially qualify. Not necessarily get money because you have to meet all of the criteria, but for what we're talking about right now, if you're over 65, you can qualify. Generally speaking, because there's a base pension, that's just anybody over 65. Then there's homebound, meaning you would really need the assistance of somebody else in order to be able to leave the home. So if you're driving a car yourself, you're not going to be homebound. If you can get in there and drive around, by definition, you're not going to be homebound there. And then there's aid and attendance, and that's the highest level. And generally, there would need to be some significant cognitive impairment or need assistance with activities of daily living in order to qualify for that. So this is generally, unless you're in a skilled nursing facility, going to be supported by having a doctor sort of affirm, what is this person's health status looking like? What are their limitations? And I kind of joke that this is kind of the one time you want a doctor to say you're not looking so hot, because that actually helps in terms of the qualification there.
When you're trying to determine the whether or not somebody will qualify based off of their ability to function, and you're looking at what activities are they able to perform, the sort of traditional activities of daily living, things like being able to eat, bathing, basic needs, are part of it, but the VA also considers what are called incidental activities of daily living. So ADLs and IADLs, that are things like medication management or cooking, things that support some of the basic functions, but maybe aren't in and of themselves basic functions. So people can be surprised that they actually qualify based on what it is that the VA will consider in support of an individual's level of functioning.
Yeah, and I've been putting in these applications for 10 years now, and I have never found anybody qualified for the middle level. Every person I've ever put in an application for is either considered base or aid and attendance. And I've taught on panels in different places around the country and asked other people who've put in a significant number of these applications, and have scarcely ever found anybody who has been qualified as this homebound. It's virtually always going to be either aid and attendance or base pension.
When you're thinking about whether or not things like activities of daily living, whether or not an individual is able to do them, you also need to think about the situation around them. I mean, I've had many conversations with families where I'm told, well, they can dress themselves just fine. That wouldn't be something to support this kind of a benefit. But when I ask them further questions about it, the reason they can do that is because they've transitioned all of their clothes to things without buttons or zippers, that everything's either pull-on or Velcro or elastic waists. But if they were to dress themselves with all different kinds of clothing, then it would be an issue. Or with feeding, for example, that there's only certain foods that they're eating. So if the people in your life are really supporting your lifestyle, and that's what allows you to actually do some of these activities of daily living, those may be things that you want to communicate to your doctor so they get a good picture of what exactly the situation is for the person, to be able to make an accurate evaluation of whether or not that person has need for assistance.
So then the next criteria here is income. And so what the VA is going to do is look at any sources of income you might have, your pension from work, your Social Security, the money that you're getting off of investments, and that's going to be your gross income. And by gross, it's prior to any kind of deductions, and it's both spouses if the person is married. So both of these spouses, all of their income is going to be sort of added up. And then what they do is they subtract any kind of unreimbursed medical expenses as a deduction. And so it's pretty important that there's something that's eating up the income in order to qualify for this program. So if you don't have any medical expenses right now, and your income is higher than what they list as the income limits, you're not missing out on any money. If you were base pension and you have $20,000 worth of income and no deductions, well, yeah, you don't qualify for any money. But what they do a terrible job of explaining in any of the literature, in my experience, is when you take that gross income, you're supposed to subtract then any unreimbursed medical expenses you have that on a recurring basis. And then that net amount is what they consider to be your income. So I've had instances where people have looked at this program, and one of the spouses is in an assisted living facility, and they're paying the assisted living facility $5,000 a month. And they personally are taking in income like $3,000 a month. So it's wiping them out, and they're paying the balance out of their own assets. But they looked at this program and say, well, we earn $3,000 a month. That's $36,000 a year. And the program says the or the income limit is like $27,000 a year. So we didn't bother applying. Well, that's because they didn't realize that the income limit is after all of these deductions. And just no literature is very clear about that point. And so If you have unreimbursed medical expenses and are determining whether or not the person qualifies, you take a look at, okay, what is our net income after all of these expenses?
I've also experienced people where they're pursuing this benefit to find out whether or not they're going to qualify because they're expecting that their health situation is going to change, that they're going to be transitioning into like assisted living, but they haven't actually started incurring that expense yet. So they're basing it off of, well, these are my current expenses, but in 3 months, when this transition actually happens, then I'm going to have this ongoing expense from there. So if there are going to be significant changes in your circumstances, you want to make sure that you're not applying until those changes have actually happened. You can't do it sort of preemptively.
Okay, so that's the basics on income. The reason why you would want to have the significant unreimbursed medical expenses is if you have minor ones, so they take your gross income and you subtract the unreimbursed medical expenses, and then you have your net income after that. That net income, your income for VA purposes, is what they internally call it, and sometimes use the acronym IVAP. Well, they're going to take that IVAP and subtract that amount from the amount that they would have awarded you. So it's good if the IVAP, your income after all these deductions, is zero, because then they subtract zero from what they're going to award you. It's possible to put in an application with modest expenses that are deducted from income, but the benefit might not be all that much money, if any at all. Because as an example, you had $4,000 of income and $1,500 worth of expenses, well, then your IVAP is $2,500. And if they would have awarded you $2,000, well, $2,000 minus the $2,500 of income that you have is zero. They won't give you anything. Okay, so we've gone through service qualification, medical status, and the levels of payment that are awarded. The income, and now the last one is assets. So only certain asset levels qualify to get any assistance in paying for care. Well, one of those things is that the total amount of countable assets has to be right around $129,000. So if you have 300 grand in the bank, yeah, you don't qualify for this program. $129,000 of countable assets. Now, there's some stuff that doesn't qualify as a countable asset, doesn't count towards this program.
Right. So one of the probably the most common ones is the house. Making sure that you're not considering the value of your house when you're looking at what assets count for purposes for this program. Now, there's a lot of overlap and similarities between the VA program and Medicaid, but they differ on some significant points as well. And what assets count and what assets don't count for this purpose is a kind of an area where I see the most amount of confusion between these two programs. So for VA purposes, your house is not a countable asset, and the acreage around your house is not countable, but only up to a certain amount. So it's your house and basically 2 acres. You want to make sure that you're considering the value of that. If you have land outside of that, that might be countable for this purpose.
One exemption for that is if you can't sell the surrounding land without selling the house because of, for instance, some kind of zoning restriction where, hey, I live in an area where you have to have at least 8 acres and I own 10, your 6 acres that you couldn't possibly sell without selling your house. Yeah, those are going to be exempt.
Mm-hmm. Your prepaid final expenses, so prepaying a funeral, burial, that kind of thing is also not counted. The value of a vehicle is not counted. So you want to make sure that you're sort of taking these things out and setting them to the side, that these are not assets that the VA would count in deciding whether or not I would qualify for this kind of a benefit. So if you're setting these aside and looking at what you have left and adding up what these amounts are, that's the amount that you're looking at that needs to be under the about $125,000. I'm sorry, $129,000. And that's for both a single person and a married couple. This is also an area where I see a lot of confusion with Medicaid, where there are differences between single and married. With the VA, there's one amount that applies to the situation as a whole.
Yeah. So if it's a single person or a married couple, it's the same asset amount when it comes to qualification. There was a very large change in the law for the VA in October of 2018. It used to be that if somebody wasn't qualified, the person could do planning or make gifts or anything else and become qualified the very next day, for instance. In 2018, they added something that would be referred to as a 3-year look-back period. So basically on an application now, if you're requesting this sort of assistance, this payment from them, they will say, okay, what have you done in the last 3 years? Have you transferred any of your additional assets, any of the stuff that you wouldn't have been allowed to hold on to and qualify for our program? And if the answer is yes, then there can be a delay because they attribute basically a penalty to that and say, okay, for every, and it's about $2,200 a month, or excuse me, $2,200 that you transferred, we're going to not give you coverage for a month. So there is a look back period now. And this is another one of those differences between the VA and Medicaid. The VA has a 3-year look back period. Medicaid has a 5-year look back period. So if you're doing any planning in advance, because you think, boy, I might be facing these care costs in the future, you need to be aware of some of these differences, and certainly whatever attorney you're working with should be, if you're a veteran, should be well versed in both the VA pension benefit and the Medicaid rules, because you never know which program you're going to need to rely on more. And some stuff that you can do for Medicaid, you can't do for the VA, and vice versa. So you want to get the best of both worlds, and there is ways to do planning that gets you good results no matter what happens to you. And so we should probably mention, we've been talking about this pension, but what is the actual, amounts or benefit? So for a single person who is a veteran themselves and they need aid and attendance, which is the highest level of care, that's just under $23,000 a year. So a pretty significant amount. And we should also mention that this pension is entirely tax-free for both veterans and the surviving spouses of veterans, completely tax-free.
And one of the benefits of it as well is that it's paid directly to the veteran. It's not paid to an agency or to a healthcare worker directly. It's paid to you or it's essentially just directly deposited into the checking account, and then you can direct it and use it to pay for care as you feel you need it.
Yes. So you don't have to inquire with a facility if you go into like an assisted living facility, hey, do you participate in this VA program or anything like that? Because the VA program is essentially the VA paying you money. And I can tell you from experience, every facility takes cash. So you don't have any kind of complications in working with the facilities on this. They'll take your payment. For married couples, the highest benefit level is just a hair over $27,000 per year, again, tax-free. And then on surviving spouses of veterans, if it's aid and attendance, it's about $14,700 a year. And so it's paid monthly. So you divide that number by 12, and that would be the maximum amount. And you get it every month, direct deposited in your account. And you can use it on these unreimbursed medical expenses.
One of the places where I've really seen this program to have the most power and the most impact is for if a person wants to stay home and have care brought into their home. Because it's paid directly to you, you can use it for care brought into your home. You can also use it if you have family members that are providing you a lot of assistance to stay home. I've so commonly worked with families where a loved one who has maybe had an increase in the assistance that they require, one of their loved ones is then either retiring early, maybe taking a leave of absence from work, going down to part-time hours, so that they can have enough time to provide that additional assistance. This VA benefit can be very helpful in family members being able to afford to provide this assistance, because now they have maybe a reduced income of their own, but they want to be the one helping you. You can use this benefit to help pay them to provide the care to you. That you can't do that with spouses. Unfortunately, spouses have an obligation to continue to take care of each other, but you can use it for other family members and friends and other people that you might want to reimburse for this type of assistance down the road. So that's really where I've seen it have some of the biggest impact on a family.
Yeah, and that impact it can be huge, because they're doing hard work. It's appropriate to be compensating them. How do we make sure that everybody involved can afford to be providing this kind of care or receiving this kind of care? And these caregiver contracts can be critical. They also really need to be used to qualify the expenses for the VA program, but then also to not end up getting in trouble if you need to qualify for Medicaid later, because Medicaid has their whole own set of rules about the fact that you have to have notarized contracts in place if you're going to be paying family members for care, or they're going to say when you apply for them a couple of years later, because maybe you transitioned into a nursing home by that point and you don't have $120,000 a year to pay for it, they're going to say, boy, without a contract in place, we're going to call all that stuff gifts. And since you made those gifts within 5 years of applying for a program, we're going to have significant penalties on that. So again, this is just another example of if you're working for the VA program, you need to work with an attorney who's accredited by the Department of Veterans Affairs and very much knows the ins and outs of that program, but also is an elder law attorney that understands Medicaid, because one thing can screw up the other very significantly. We should also mention that in any of these sorts of applications, so not talking about doing any kind of planning, but if you're just, hey, if it sounds like you qualify for this program right now, nobody can charge you to assist in an application. That would be completely illegal. There's a federal law against that. So there's assistance through the veteran service officers. Every county has got a VSO's office who can assist with this kind of thing. There are also other available programs and people who can process these applications. But again, nobody can charge you for that sort of thing. And I've seen some kind of underhanded ways where these applications are getting charged for.
There was like Peter mentioned earlier, there was a pretty significant change that happened in October of 2018. So you also want to make sure that whatever information you're looking at or whoever you're talking to, that it's current information, because there was such a significant overhaul of this program that happened. If you're looking at anything prior to that date, it's going to be completely incorrect in most circumstances. So make sure if you're seeking information on your own that you're only looking at things that were done after that to provide you with the best information. And like Peter mentioned, the VSO, the Veteran Service Office in your local county, is one of the great places to go to find out more information.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions here that we're going to pivot to. So we've got kind of qualified veteran and their qualified spouse non-veteran. So I don't know what they mean by qualified, but if they're a non-veteran, but get simultaneous veteran benefits being discussed today. Okay, so if it's a married couple, the application is always going to be based on the veteran. So if the veteran is healthy, you're putting in an application because you have all these unreimbursed medical expenses because maybe the spouse isn't healthy, but it's going to be based on the veteran's health status. So the veteran is actually going to be applying for base pension because they're healthy and they don't have the criteria to meet homebound or aid in attendance. But they can use both their own and their spouse's unreimbursed medical expenses in order to qualify. So they can get the base pension with a healthy veteran. If they were, for instance, both sick, it's still just the veteran that's putting in the application during the veteran's lifetime. So they can get this benefit program, but their spouse wouldn't receive any money unless the veteran passed away, and then the spouse would be qualified as the surviving spouse for that reduced pension amount. They're going to look at another question that sort of related to this was whose income and expenses and assets are they going to look at? Both of them. I don't know if we clearly stated that earlier, but both veterans, if they are not divorced, they're looking at both people's, the gross income between both parties and all of the assets. It doesn't make a lick of difference whose name it's in. It's either an exempt asset because it's like the home or a car for personal transportation purposes or any of those set aside type of assets, or it counts because it's in there, one of the two of their names.
This is one of the areas where the Medicaid and the VA program are similar, that it for marriage purposes or marital asset purposes, it doesn't matter what you and your spouse may have agreed to between the two of you, that this is something I own or this is not something I own. Medicaid and the VA look at everything that the two of you have, even if the way that you have it titled is to indicate it's separately owned by one of you, unless you're doing something like Peter was talking about very specifically. Their even marital property agreements are not something that they consider as, well, this is isolating these assets for only this person.
Yeah, doesn't make any difference. If it's in one of the two names of the spouses, it counts.
And one of the follow-up questions to that was about a couple that is separated. There is not a legal separation, but they're living separately. With a legal separation, legal separation is actually very difficult to get. Most courts want either a divorce or not. Legal separation is usually reserved for situations where like health insurance is a big priority or there's a very unique circumstance. But even in a situation like that, they're still going to look at the assets of both, regardless of their lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think the question specified a not legal separation. So if they're still married, it's counting all of the assets. It doesn't matter that you don't live together, for instance. And then one of the questions is, what are the benefits, assets and income and expenses accountable when both spouses are veterans? Same asset limitations, same income stuff. It's just that the pension benefit level, if they were both rated for like aid and attendance, the highest pension benefit level that each of them can get is just a little bit over $36,000 a year. So they get an increased pension amount, but nothing much else changes about it.
And then another question about gaining access to information. So if we're looking for information, how do we get information from you, or how do we get it from other sources? There is a website that you can go to under the Department of Veterans Affairs. They do have information out there. It is a little confusing when you look at their website. I mean, it is complicated trying to figure out whether a person is qualified or not, whether or not assets count or not. So they do have a resource out there. It can be difficult to figure out your situation based on that, but it is available. Like we mentioned earlier, the local veteran service offices are also very good sources of information. They can.
And we have a bunch of information on our website in regards to this.
There is what I was going to say about the veteran service office. They can, the information they have is usually directed to a person who is in a position to qualify. They can't help people understand how to put themselves in a position or their loved one in a position to gain access to or to qualify for this benefit if they don't already. So that's really the information that can be a little harder to find. And
because they can't give you any advice.
Right. So our website does have quite a bit of information out there on both Medicaid and the VA. So make sure if you're taking a look at our information, it is all up to date. It is current based on all the changes that happened. This is another area where, depending on the information that you're looking at, you want to know when it was created, so you know whether or not it's current.
And then, as we said earlier, everybody who's registered for this program is going to get the sent to them the 2 handouts, and this information is all current. We're not sending out old info that doesn't work anymore. So hopefully that's a good starting point for everybody who's interested in this kind of thing.
We also do initial consultations with families, and those consultations right now we're doing them either by video or over the phone, talking through a situation with the family as to whether or not the person qualifies or how they might be able to get into a position to do so. We're always happy to do that as well. You can call the office if you'd like to schedule that type of a call or that type of a chat. We don't charge to do so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different planning that can be involved in the VA. And again, anything you do with VA in mind, you always have to pay attention to the potential impact it might have on Medicaid later, because it's wonderful to get this pension benefit. It's tax-free money. It can really help stretch out your life savings to make sure you can afford good care. But it has its limitations, because if you're getting, $2,200 a month from the VA, as an example, but your cost of care blows up to be $10,000 a month because you're in a skilled nursing facility, well, geez, where am I coming up with the other $7,800 a month? It might end up having to be Medicaid. And so you got to pay attention to both sides of this at all times, or else you can find yourself in a pretty sticky situation. So hopefully this was good information that you guys find valuable. As always, we'd encourage you to now do something with this information. It's great to know stuff, but it's even better to enact it to help you or the people you care about that could benefit from your knowledge here. So if anybody wants to reach out to us, you have our contact information if you need assistance with anything. Otherwise, as a reminder, we've got another program next Wednesday on May 27th at noon also.
You can also request information on our website. So please seek out good information so that you can make informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. So everybody take care, stay safe, and
stay healthy.
And hope to see you next week for another one of these. All right, take care.